When people hear the word crusades, they usually picture religious fanaticism, knights marching under crosses, holy wars fought for faith, honor, and salvation. And yes, belief mattered, a lot. But belief alone doesn't move armies across continents. Belief doesn't feed tens of thousands of people. Belief doesn't build ships, supply horses, or pay for steel. Money does. In the year 1095, Europe was not a rich place. It was fragmented, violent, and economically inefficient. Power was decentralized, kings ruled weakly, nobles controlled land but lacked liquidity. There were no standing national armies, no centralized tax systems, and no professional bureaucracies capable of financing long-distance war. Wealth existed primarily in the form of land, not cash. You could command peasants, you could extract food, but you couldn't easily mobilize money. And yet, within a few years, tens of thousands of people would travel thousands of miles across hostile territory to fight in the eastern Mediterranean. They would need weapons, armor, horses, ships, food, and months, sometimes years, of logistical support. By any modern standard, it was a military project that should have been impossible. The call that set this in motion came in November of 1095, when Pope Urban II addressed a crowd at the Council of Clermont. His message was spiritual: reclaim Jerusalem, defend Christendom, secure salvation. But beneath the theology was something else, a massive redirection of Europe's surplus violence outward, and, unintentionally at first, the creation of a new financial ecosystem. Urban II wasn't selling a war to kings, he was selling legitimacy to individuals. The crowd at Clermont was filled with knights, land-holding warriors whose social identity revolved around violence, yet whose violence was increasingly condemned by the church. These were not monarchs with treasuries, but second and third sons with no inheritance, vassals bound by military obligation, household soldiers whose livelihoods depended on fighting. For them, crusade wasn't just a religious calling, it was a social test. To go was to prove honor, loyalty, and piety. To stay behind was to risk suspicion, moral stigma, even exclusion. Once prominent nobles took the cross, pressure cascaded downward. Participation became contagious. Faith opened the door, but honor culture pushed people through it. And they didn't go alone. Crusading armies were not professional forces, they were moving societies. Knights brought retainers, servants, craftsmen, clergy, laborers, and dependents, thousands of non-combatants whose presence turned expeditions into mass migrations. Europe didn't just export soldiers, it exported surplus violence, instability, and social tension outward, redirecting it toward a distant frontier where salvation was the only promised return. The First Crusade, launched between 1096 and 1099, involved an estimated 60 to 100,000 people, including non-combatants. For individual knights, the cost of participation could equal several years of income. There were no state stipends, no war bonds, no treasury checks. Crusaders had to finance themselves. So they liquidated. Nobles sold land at steep discounts. They mortgaged estates to monasteries. They borrowed heavily from moneylenders. Some pledged future harvests. Others promised political favors. What mattered was not long-term solvency, but immediate liquidity. Salvation was time-sensitive. Debt could be dealt with later. This was the first quiet shift. War stopped being something you merely fought. It became something you financed. And once war becomes a financial operation, it starts attracting intermediaries. Italian merchant republics like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa quickly realized what was happening. Crusaders didn't just need swords, they needed ships, transport, credit, supplies, ports, warehousing, insurance against loss. These cities were not crusading out of piety alone. They were selling services to a continent desperate to move men and material eastward. By the early 12th century, crusading routes became trade routes. Ports that serviced crusaders grew wealthy, shipbuilders expanded, contracts multiplied. What began as religious mobilization evolved into a logistics industry. And the church watched all of this carefully. The medieval church was not just a spiritual institution, it was a transnational organization operating across unstable kingdoms. It owned land, it ran courts, it educated elites, it recorded births and deaths, and, crucially, it had moral authority that no king could match. But it did not have a standing tax system. It could not simply levy income taxes or issue debt in the modern sense. The Crusades changed that. To fund ongoing campaigns, the church authorized new forms of taxation. Clergy were taxed, laity were taxed. In some cases, people could pay instead of fighting. Indulgences were offered in exchange for financial support. What began as emergency fundraising slowly hardened into recurring revenue. This is where belief became leverage. The more the Crusades continued, the more permanent their financial structures became. Military orders like the Knights Templar, founded around 1119, emerged to protect pilgrims and fight in the Holy Land, but they quickly evolved into something else. They accepted deposits, they transferred funds across borders, they issued early forms of letters of credit, allowing pilgrims to travel without carrying large amounts of cash. By the early 12th century, the Templars were operating one of the most sophisticated financial networks in Europe, wearing armor but thinking like bankers. And then came the moment that stripped away any illusion that faith was always the primary driver. In 1202, the Fourth Crusade was launched. Crusaders contracted Venice to transport them to the east. The price was enormous. When the Crusaders couldn't pay, Venice didn't cancel the expedition. It redirected it. First to attack the Christian city of Zara, then in 1204 to sack Constantinople itself, one of the richest Christian cities in the world, using crusaders as mercenaries. The result was catastrophic for Byzantium. The result was enormously profitable for Venice. Trade privileges, territory, wealth, influence. The crusade had not failed, it had simply followed the money. By this point, the pattern was set. The Crusades had created a system where belief mobilized people, but finance determined outcomes. Institutions learned how to extract value from moral language. War became sustainable not because it succeeded militarily, but because it generated economic activity. Europe didn't stumble into this transformation consciously, it learned by doing. And once the machinery existed, merchants, financiers, taxes, military orders, it no longer depended on spiritual enthusiasm alone. The Crusades would eventually lose their religious urgency. Jerusalem would change hands. Acre would fall in 1291, ending the last major Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land. But the financial structures built to sustain holy war did not disappear. They evolved. Because once a society learns how to finance power, it rarely forgets. By the time the Crusades entered their second century, the machinery surrounding them mattered more than the battlefield outcomes themselves. What had begun as a desperate mobilization of faith had hardened into a repeatable process, one that reliably converted belief into money and money into institutional power. And like all systems that learn how to extract value, it began to shape incentives in ways few participants fully understood at the time. The first clear winners were the intermediaries. Italian merchant republics didn't need the Crusades to succeed militarily. They needed them to continue. As long as armies moved east, ships were required, supplies were needed, credit had to flow. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa embedded themselves so deeply into crusading logistics that war became a commercial dependency. Ports expanded, shipyards multiplied, contracts replaced vows. The crusader might fight for salvation, but the merchant sailed for margin. This shift mattered because it changed who bore the risk. When a crusade failed, the losses were not evenly distributed. The nobles who sold land to finance participation often returned ruined, if they returned at all. Peasants paid higher taxes to support absent lords. Local economies were destabilized by sudden liquidation of estates. Meanwhile, the institutions that financed transport and logistics collected fees regardless of outcome. War had become asymmetric. Losses were personal. Profits were institutional.
Military orders accelerated this imbalance. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers accumulated land across Europe, accepted donations from crusaders seeking spiritual insurance, and managed assets on a scale previously unknown. They were exempt from many local taxes, they answered directly to the Pope, and they operated across borders with ease. In effect, they functioned as multinational corporations centuries before the term existed, extracting value from conflict while remaining insulated from its immediate costs. And the Church itself adapted quickly. What began as emergency taxation to fund holy war became normalized fiscal authority. Crusading taxes, once temporary, were renewed repeatedly. Indulgences expanded beyond participation to funding. The moral logic remained intact, but the financial implications were profound. The Church had discovered a way to raise revenue across borders without standing armies or bureaucracies. Belief did the enforcement, guilt handled compliance. Over time, the original justification began to matter less than the revenue stream it supported. Crusades were launched against new targets, heretics, political enemies, even Christian cities.